The debate over tax reform has sure been heated. As North Dakota's former tax commissioner, I've always said that I am willing and eager to work with Republicans and Democrats on tax reform that supports workers, families, and retirees. And I've said it should be fiscally responsible and grow our economy. I held listening sessions across North Dakota, had many discussions with top White House officials, including the president, and I tried to change this bill so it supports working families. But unfortunately, the final bill is strictly a partisan plan that was hastily put together. It would, I believe, damage North Dakotans in the long term. I still think a healthy debate of ideas makes for good policy and for a good episode of The Hot Dish. So today, I'm talking with two experts on public policy and taxes, one Democrat and one Republican, to see if we can find some common ground on ideas that would benefit North Dakota families.
My first guest needs no introduction, especially for my North Dakota listeners. Senator Kent Conrad represented our state in the United States Senate for 26 years. He was the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee and played a vital role in shaping our nation's fiscal policies during the last 3 decades. And like me, Kent was first elected in North Dakota as tax commissioner, so he knows this issue frontward and backward. Senator Conrad, thank you so much to The Hot Dish, and I'll give our listeners the caveat that we're recording this conversation before the full details of the final tax proposal. So we're just waiting for the final amount, but what I really wanted to talk to you about is the work that you did trying to get the debt under control, and then your impressions of what you think this bill that we're considering right now will actually do to the deficit and what that means for economic policy and economic growth going forward.
You know, I guess I'm a product of North Dakota. I remember growing up in our household in Bismarck, and my grandfather, who'd gone through the Great Depression, warning me and our family about debt, whether it was personal debt or government debt or debt on a company, that debt can work with you and for you up to a point, but when you have too much debt, it can crush you. And we've certainly seen that in North Dakota over the years. I go back to the agricultural crisis in the 80s when people had high levels of debt, and I can so remember people coming in my office who were literally crushed by debt. And, you know, there were a lot of very sad outcomes as a result. That can happen to a country, too. We've seen that throughout economic history. Taking on too much debt is a dangerous thing. And so what's most disturbing about the bill that's going through Congress now is at a time when the economy is strong, unemployment is low, they are choosing to add dramatically to the debt by at least $1 trillion, and I think you and I both know that that's the official forecast, but we also know all the games that have been played in writing this bill, all the little tricks that have been used to make it look as though it's costing less than it will really cost. So the more likely outcome is this will add $1.5 trillion to the debt, a debt that's already too big. So my great concern is simply that.
You know, it's interesting because you hire people who do this analysis, whether it's the Joint Committee on Taxation or whether it is taking a look at CBO, all of these folks who actually know how to put numbers to paper, to an analysis and come up with an amount. Not one expert in this field, no matter if they're conservative or liberal, has said this will pay for itself. But yet that is the story that we hear all over and over and over again. The real challenge here is something I want to talk to you about because it has your name attached to it, which is the Conrad rule, which was waived when we put together this package in the Senate, or the House and the Senate put together this package, the majority party. And if you can just talk a little bit about why you had a lot of pride about the Conrad rule and what kind of games get played when you waive it.
You know, so I remember well writing the Conrad rule when we were dealing with the Bush tax cuts, George W. Bush, had tax cuts, again, that weren't paid for. We were told the same thing, that, oh, yes, they would pay for themselves. So we can go back and look now and see what actually happened. And, of course, they didn't pay for themselves. Instead, it ballooned the debt. And remember, by 2008, we were on the brink of a depression. We were in the middle of a financial collapse. The economy was shrinking at a rate of 9% a year. We were adding 800,000 people to the unemployment rolls every month. I mean, this was a staggering circumstance we were in. After we were promised, if we just did the Bush tax cuts, they'd pay for themselves, and we'd have very strong economic growth. Instead, they didn't pay for themselves. The debt ballooned, and at the end of the period, we were on the brink of a financial collapse. That's the record here that's very clear.
We know when we take out a mortgage, we take on debt, but yet we're building equity in a home and hopefully saving for our retirement by saving that equity. When we look at borrowing money as, and not too much, but borrowing money to get ahead educationally, which would put more money in your pocket because you could be a higher wage earner. And so we look at some of these things as investments, whether it's infrastructure, whether it is looking at investing in things like Alzheimer's research, because we know that as we age and as we live longer, Alzheimer's is a disease that is going to not only cripple families and break their hearts, but it's going to break the bank. And so now that we've done this, we have limited what we can invest in the future, and in terms of things that could pay off. And that's very problematic to me. And when you look at this pay-go situation, anticipating again, trying to put some guardrails on overspending and running up the debt, Congress says, well, if the debt gets out of hand, you've got to find a way to pay for it. And guess what we're going to look at? We're going to look at hundreds of billions of dollars in reductions in Medicare. We're going to look at a farm program being decimated unless this gets waived. And so there's real consequences to debt driving up beyond, the moral imperative of not passing this on to our children.
One thing we know is when you have high levels of debt and you do tax cuts that are not paid for, over time, because you have higher debt, that puts upward pressure on interest rates. That means people have to pay more for a mortgage. That means they have to pay more on a college loan. That means they have to pay more on a car loan. Those increases in interest rates hurt long-term economic growth.
When you look at income and wealth disparity, especially wealth disparity, and you watch those curves, in 1986, which is about the time that we were really doing fiscal policy. In fact, we were talking about paying off, not only balancing our budget, but actually paying off our debt. I remember that. Remember, when you get into the 90s and you guys were working those plans, we had that great hope. It was the beginning. And it kind of coincides with when you showed up, when we started adjusting it. But what's really interesting to me is during those years, there was a wide expanse where it wasn't the wealthiest people in this country who had all of the assets of the country. Now you basically have the top 1% having more wealth concentrated in those folks than the bottom 40. I mean, it's just incredible. And this is going to exacerbate that problem. And so for that reason, I really believed we should have given middle-class tax cuts. And I believe, as you did, that we need to do something with the corporate tax structure, but it needed to be fiscally responsible. It's just really pretty remarkable how this plan misses the mark in so many ways.
And, the opportunity, I guess the thing that's so disturbing when you've got this large debt, $20 trillion debt, more than 100% of the size of our economy, and now we're going to borrow money, much of it from the Chinese, to give a tax cut that disproportionately goes to the wealthiest among us. It just doesn't make much sense. And the thing that's most troubling is it could have been paid for. It could have been paid for. We could have a middle-class tax cut. We could have reduced the top corporate rate to make us more competitive. we could have paid for it by shutting down some of these offshore tax scams that are so prevalent, that are benefiting people who already have tremendous assets. By the way, I was just talking to Senator Dorgan, and we were talking about Ugland House. Ugland House is a little 5-story building in the Cayman Islands that claims to be the home of 18,000 corporations. A little 5-story building claims to be the operating headquarters for 18,000 corporations. Now, you think that's either the most efficient building in the world, or they're engaged in an enormous tax scam.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but can you imagine all of the assets of these corporations that they have camped there? You know, their intellectual property. I mean, and the tax rate there is zero. There's a reason why they're sourcing that income there. And, you know, when you look at this plan, this is something, like you said, we could have paid for this by, you know, a 25% rate, by actually taking care of things like that. And I think there is a lot of speculation that this bill will not hit that mark, that this will even potentially make it worse. I just get worried about the lack of continuity in fiscal policy totally, you know, whether it is spending along with taxes, along with trade policy, along with monetary policy. This is going to drive interest rates up and have the consequences that you just described, Kent. It's going to cost average people who need to, you know, get a home mortgage or get an operating loan at the farm or get buy a new vehicle to get to work. Those folks are going to pay more as a result of it.
You know, one of my former Republican colleagues who was a great ally in the fight to try to get us back on track, get our fiscal house in order in Washington, called me the other day, and he said, Kent, what has happened to my party? We used to be focused on fiscal responsibility, and now the Republican Party, my party, this is my former colleague speaking to me, my party, when times are good, when we should be paying down a debt that's already too large, are adding to the debt and adding to it big time. And he said, he said it just makes my head ache to see my party going from a party that stood for fiscal responsibility, at least having budgets that added up, now deciding they're not going to reduce the debt when times are good, which you'd normally expect, but they're going to add to the debt when times are good with a debt that's already too high. I mean, it really is kind of amazing.
It's pretty amazing. It's a tough deal, and I told someone recently, I said, I didn't really go there to do a tax package that looks like this. We could have done some, I think, really excellent work to try and make our system simpler, which this does not do, try and make it fair, which this does not do, and try and make it respond to the global economy better. And I don't think this does it. So it misses it on so many marks, and on top of that, it just misses the mark of fiscal accountability for me.
I think history will show that this was a huge missed opportunity. Because just as you described, we could have done some things that really would have helped the middle class. We could have done some things that really would help make us more competitive. But we could have done it in a fiscally responsible way that just didn't balloon the debt that's already too large.
I'll close with this story because I think it really informed my thinking. I was at a event for veterans on Veterans Day at the Heritage Center, and I got done, and I was just saying hello to some of the vets who had come, and this Vietnam vet, in his late 60s, early 70s, came up to me and he said, Senator, I'd really like a tax cut. And I thought, well, that's fair. We all would, I suppose. And so I smiled and I said, I hear you. And he said, but I want you to understand something. If it means that my grandkids are going to have to pay for it, I don't need it that bad. And here's a veteran who put on a uniform, served his country, and he was still thinking about what's really good for his country and not just good for him. And I thought, that's a North Dakota attitude, isn't it?
That's the North Dakota I know. North Dakota.
Me too.
I always thought, I used to tell my colleagues, if on fiscal matters we'd let the people of North Dakota decide for the nation, our country would be in a lot better shape, because North Dakota people have common sense. They know when somebody tells them a story that's too good to be true, that it's too good to be true. And they know you shouldn't just pile up debt on top of debt, that's a dangerous thing. It may not hit you immediately, but over time, when you take on too much debt, it leads to bad outcomes. And the people of North Dakota understand that, I think, better than almost any people in the country.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And, there's one other thing that I know for sure, that every member, whether they're in the House of Representatives or in the Senate, is going to get a tax break because of this, but not every citizen of our country is. Listen, Kent, it is always great to talk to you. There's a whole lot of what-ifs in this package, and it's just really unfortunate that we haven't fashioned something that is more responsive to the needs of the country. So,
well,
thanks so much,
it all
Kent.
works if elephants fly. Well, Merry Christmas, Heidi.
Merry Christmas to you, and have a great time.
Thanks for your hard work.
Thank you for your friendship and your counsel.
Next, I'll be speaking with Phil Swagel, a professor in international economic policy at the Maryland School of Public Policy. As a moderate Republican and former economic advisor to President Bush, Phil has a different perspective on tax reform than my first guest, Kent Conrad. And I'm willing to bet we'll find plenty to agree on as we discuss the details of the tax reform bill. Phil was Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the Treasury Department from December 2006 to January 2009, and was previously Chief of Staff and Senior Economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, as well as an economist at the International Monetary Fund and the Federal Reserve Board. He received a bachelor's degree in economics from Princeton in 1987 and a PhD in economics from Harvard in 1993. Phil, welcome to the Hot Dish, and thank you for bringing your unique perspective to the issue of tax reform.
Thanks very much, Senator.
Yeah, you've been through this whole circus and up and down off the hill and over on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And I think one of the things that we were so excited that you were willing to do this is your broad perspective on fiscal policy writ large, not just tax policy. And one of the concerns that I've had all along with just looking at tax policy as a major economic driver is it doesn't take into consideration what's going to happen with monetary policy. And I think right now the disruption that we're seeing in trade policy, which I think you and I would probably agree is not particularly good for the economics of this country. But one of the looming and really unseen but huge, clearly the monster that I think is coming at us is our debt and deficit.
Absolutely, Senator. And this bill is going to add, $1.5 trillion over 10 years to the deficit. But really, once you take into account the gimmicks here, we're talking $2 trillion over 10 years. So
yeah.
it's a big impact on the deficit, and that's got to be a big risk.
Well, and it's a big gamble that you're going to see some economic growth. And I'm not someone, I think there's some people in our party who would say, well, none of this would really have an impact on economic growth. I think it will have an impact on economic growth. But I think it is not telling the truth to say this is going to pay for itself. Do you agree?
I do agree. As you said, there will be growth, and I think 2018 is going to surprise people. That growth is really going to be pretty good, and even into 2019. But not enough to raise the revenue to pay for itself. There's just no way.
When you look at this, I think one of the points of discouragement that I had is that I thought we really could achieve a middle-class tax cut. I thought that we needed to do a middle-class tax cut. We needed to harmonize our federal system, our federal corporate tax system with the global tax system so that you didn't see games being played back and forth. I will tell you one of the concerns that I have now is that it seems clear to me that people like me who happen to be fortunate enough to be later, older in life and established economically, that I am going to get huge benefits from this. But yet my son and my hopefully future daughter-in-law are not only going to pay this debt, but they aren't going to see the big benefit. And they are really the people we want to provide that economic incentive to.
Yeah, it's a tough one because we know there's going to be some near-term benefits. But as you say, there's long-term risks. And the debt that we're creating, that's the long-term risk that your kids and my kids, I have 3 kids, are going to be facing. My feeling is that if the economy can be strong enough now, and boost job creation and especially boost wages throughout the income distributions, that middle class and really lower income Americans finally see rising wages, it will be worth it. But that's, but it's hard to say, right? It's hard to say that this is going to be the thing that boosts those wages. Well,
and I think that the projections on wage boost, which is, you're going to see a $4,000 increase in your wages. If people really believe that, I hope they're not spending that money right now.
No, I mean, the estimates I've seen is that the typical family in North Dakota is going to see maybe $600, $700 in tax cut. So it's not nothing. It's meaningful.
Sure.
But 4,000 is a bit much.
Yeah. Well, and the other piece of that is that if you look at the typical family, that's good. But come 2025, it's a whole different situation. And it goes back to what you said about gimmicks in this bill. They didn't make the individual reductions permanent. The reason why they didn't do that, it would have broken the bank. Right, on the $1.5 trillion that was their top end ceiling. And so they say, don't worry, we're going to fix this. And I have been here long enough. I've done year-end extenders. I've done the doc fix, which everybody waits until the last minute to do. That's not the way to run the railroad. Let's be honest about what we're doing with fiscal policy and then allow for the certainty. The other piece of this that I'm very concerned about, Phil, is that because it was not a sit down and everybody kind of work through the discussion the way Ronald Reagan did in '86, so that when you get done, everybody owns it. Everybody owns it. Now, only one party owns it. If we see a shift in politics here, where you have, again, another party in control, do you really have the certainty that's going to help build the economic response to this?
No, I agree. That's a key risk here is the uncertainty. As you said, on the personal side, the provisions expire. And who knows what will happen, what the Congress will look like, who will be in charge. I certainly would have liked everything to be permanent and to be bipartisan. It's above my pay grade. Look, I'm glad the business side is permanent because, as you said, our old tax system on the business side really didn't make sense. I mean, it penalized American firms, and so we're improving that. I wish we could do the same on the personal side.
But is it really permanent? When you do it the way you've done it with 50 votes or 51 votes, and, politics being what it is, the pendulum swings. I think we need to amend this bill. We need to fix the things that I don't agree with in this bill. And I think we're going to find out that there's looming and gaping loopholes in this bill. I'm really concerned about what happened with the pass-throughs at the last minute, because all of a sudden there's a huge incentive for everybody to run to their tax lawyer and start becoming a 1099 employee as opposed to a W-2 employee. There's a huge interest in figuring out how the offshoring rules are going to work and how the credits are going to work. And so, to me, we don't know what all the trap doors are that's going to make this bill even more expensive.
No, I agree. It started out as a reform bill, and the idea is to simplify the tax system, and it will for many families, right? I mean, the larger standard deduction means many families will basically file a 1099, a 1040 EZ, and that's it. They're done. But as you said, the business side is complicated. The international side is complicated.
I challenge people when they say it's tax simplification. And I'll tell you why. Mm-hmm. Because right now, those folks who don't have a mortgage, who don't have a lot of deductions that would go on the Schedule A, they're probably not performing the Schedule A. But people, you say standard deduction or filing a Schedule A, which is the itemized deduction, they're still going to have to do the form to find out where their advantage is. I mean, you're going to probably do both forms to figure out if the standard deduction is going to work better for you. If they really, the only way you can say this is tax simplification is if you actually eliminated the Schedule A, which they didn't.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And there's many families who are just barely on the Schedule A now, and they're going to say, oh, no, there's no way. I'll just take the standard deduction. But you're right, of course, the families at the margin.
Yeah, but the other piece of this that no one's talking about, which I find so interesting, is the elimination of the personal exemptions. So when you say we're doubling the standard deduction, you've lost your personal exemption. Now, if you have children under the age of 17, you're going to get an increased child credit, right, which could be refundable. But losing that individual exemption, you got to look at the difference between what your personal exemption was and the doubling of the standard deduction. And no one's talking about that, which I find really interesting, Phil.
No, that's right. And I was going to say, I live in Maryland, right, and we have relatively high state taxes. And, of course, we're going to lose much of the state and local deduction. So it's the same thing. That for many people, they're going to have to do more complications. Honestly, TurboTax is going to do it for a lot of people. But you're right. It's simplification only to a point. And not for everyone.
I think one of the best leading indicators of whether this is simplification is the fact that H&R Block, after they read it, that their stock went up over 13%. In just a couple days, because they're like, everybody's going to go to H&R Block. And that the clear thing for so many of the people that I talk to in North Dakota is the devil I know is better than the devil I don't know. And they had made their plans. They knew what that tax code was going to look like. Now we've created a level of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is going to drive people, I think, to tax accountants. It's going to drive people to tax lawyers, and everybody's going to be looking for those loopholes. And so, I honestly think that we could have done something that was much more simple and would have been very beneficial. And I like what you said, which is, everybody said, well, this is so complicated, but once you've gotten used to using tax products like TurboTax, like H&R Block's products, it's plug in the numbers. In fact, now take a picture of your W-2 and they do it for you. And so, we have the mechanisms to file tax returns that are so much more simple, but we aren't using those. I mean, we're not giving the IRS the money to actually create a system where somebody could say, all I've got is wage income. I'm going to take a picture of my W-2 or just plug in the number, the federal ID number of my employer, because that's all my income, and the IRS is going to file my tax return.
Yeah, for many people, it should be that way.
Right. I mean, I think that if you looked at it, probably for 50 to 60 people or percent of the people, that would work great.
That's right. And again, it's anyone with income low enough to be on the double standard deduction.
Yeah. Well, but let's also say it's anyone who doesn't have a lot of unearned income. I've long had a concern about the variance in rates between people who go to work. I always say the guy who works at the Bobcat factory in North Dakota, who's working overtime, maybe he's making $80,000, $90,000 a year. But if I'm living on a trust fund and I'm making $80,000, $90,000 of unearned income, who pays a higher percentage?
It depends actually, because the unearned income, as you put it, right, first faces the corporate tax, right. So in the old system, that first got taxed at 35, and then at the dividend rate, right, which is in the low 20s. So
not if it's a pass through and it's dividend
absolutely.
that way.
No, absolutely. So that in some sense, it's like this discussion has illustrated the complication on the business side.
You know what, Phil? I think you and I could go into business together and make a lot of money.
Yeah, I kind of feel like we have a good sense of what was wrong in our old system. Yeah. And on the business side, it's almost like we just illustrated what was wrong. That are you a corporation? Are you a pass-through? Right? It's so complicated. We got part of the way to a better system with the corporate rate cut. But as you said, it brought along all these other concerns on the deficits, on the uncertainty. That's the question.
It was interesting because I think there was a lot of evaluation during that time period about many corporations. Their effective rate is below 20%. So it's that the rate change was not going to make a big difference. But they were very concerned about the loss of 199 because that that was a big driver for them in terms of their investments. And the concern that I have right now, and the missed opportunity, was to create a system that really encouraged people to develop jobs in this country. When you look at dividend income, which we've talked about, the projection is that about 35% of the people who actually get dividends from American corporations are foreign nationals. Right. So if, in fact, as we've been told by the business community, that what they're going to do with this is they're going to buy back their stock and they're going to issue dividends, that's money that's leaving the country as well.
In some sense, it's one of the unknowns of the tax cut. Will businesses invest, right? And as you said, there's certain provisions that should lead to that. The expensing, in particular, gives businesses an incentive to invest, but they could take the tax money and, as you said, buy back stock. And that's not creating jobs. It's not investing. Well,
and it's not whether they could. A lot of them have already said they will. And they can say, well, it improves the financial statement of our businesses. This is actually good for American business as well. And we can debate that point. But I think there's a law of unintended consequences. So I think that this is a discussion that's not over yet. And I think, I've been long hopeful that I will be able to, play a role in dramatic political swings that would allow a healthier discussion about some permanency in tax reform. And I also think that the EU is doing some interesting work right now on figuring out where income's being sourced. And I think those reports are going to be very informative for us kind of moving forward.
Yeah, as you said, businesses have a big incentive to try to put their profits where the tax rate is the lowest, and the EU is trying to get at that. This bill does do a lot to reduce the incentives for that in the U.S. system, but the gaming will still go on.
Well, I think that's right. I think that it's an attempt. You and I can argue about whether that this is a promise or whether it's a missed opportunity. I think proof will be in the next period of time. How people react and how people respond. And you know as well as I do that it is within the corporate prerogative and actually a fiduciary obligation to minimize your tax exposure. And so they're going to look for every opportunity that they can to reduce their taxes. That's their job.
It's not just H&R Block that will be busy. It's going to be the business tax attorneys. I was going to say, if I had a wish list, it would be where you started, I think, on the personal side, to get the permanence on the personal side. And it seems like there are things that should have bipartisan support, making the EITC better, which we know does a lot to help low-income families.
And thank you for your work on that. It's the Earned Income Tax Credit.
Exactly. And there's lots of economic research showing that motivates people who aren't working to go into the labor force and work. It basically makes work pay more. Yeah. It has bipartisan support. I know Speaker Ryan's in favor of making that better. Hopefully, if we make,
but he could have made it better in this bill.
Well, as you said,
it's kind of like he's in favor of making it better, but he didn't make it better in this bill.
Right. I mean, of course, we all know there's the $1.5 trillion is the budget, so to speak. I know that's a weird word to use here.
But he could have taken the reduction that he gave to the people at the very top and spent that on the Earned Income Tax Credit.
I see. Yeah. I mean, some of that we saw at the end, right, with Senator Rubio. Getting some more money and the child tax credit to be refundable. So you're right, that dynamic was there, just not all the way as you said.
Well, listen, I hope that we continue to have a discussion. It's been great visiting with you. I know North Dakotans, so I'll be very interested in your perspective. And they want a discussion like this. The people in my state want to know that people from different political parties and different persuasions can sit down and have an honest economic discussion. And I think you and I could have come up with the tax bill.
Well, I'm happy to help for the next one. So,
well, we'll deal with housing reform in the meantime.
Okay, no,
thanks so much, Phil. You're a great guy to come over, and I know that we all believe that we can do better for the American people.
Great, thanks very much,
Senator. You bet. If there's one thing I've learned while serving in Congress, it's that you only really make lasting change if you compromise and work across the aisle. That's what I was hoping to do with tax reform. I truly believe a bipartisan plan would have been better for North Dakota and our country. And from my conversations today with our bipartisan pair of guests, it's clear that there's plenty of common ground to be found. We just have to be willing to talk to each other and compromise, just as I try and do every day with Democrats and Republican senators. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Hot Dish, and I wish you and your family a very, very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.